Israel did not tremble because of swords. They trembled because of thrones. When the spies returned from Canaan, they didn't speak of armies. They spoke of rulers who did not age like men. Kings whose cities were built for bodies too large for human design. Kings whose presence alone collapsed courage. These were not legends from before the flood. They were alive, ruling, watching Israel approach. And for the first time, the promise of God felt uncertain. Because these kings weren't hiding in caves, they governed openly. They collected tribute, they enforced law. If God had erased the giants once, why were they still ruling after judgment? That question shattered Israel's confidence. Today, you will uncover the giant kings who survived the flood, why their rule terrified Israel more than war, and why their existence forced God to make a command so final that history itself was ordered to forget them. Because some enemies are too dangerous to remember. The flood was meant to be an ending. Waters rose, cities vanished, names were erased beneath judgment. When the earth dried, humanity believed the past had been buried forever. But centuries later, as Israel crossed deserts and borders, something felt wrong. The land ahead was not empty. Massive walls stood where none should have survived. Stone streets stretched wider than armies required. Gates were built not for caravans, but for beings of unnatural scale. These were not ruins. They were inhabited. Smoke rose from fortified cities. Banners flew above towers shaped for kings too large for human lineage. Israel was not approaching chaos. They were approaching order, an order that should not exist, because the flood had destroyed giants. Yet the land was ruled by their successors. And with every step toward Canaan, a terrifying realization emerged. Judgment had ended the age of monsters, but it had not ended their reign. Some powers do not survive by hiding, they survive by ruling. Israel did not fear defeat, they feared contradiction. The promise was clear, the land had been given to them by God. Yet every report from Canaan told a different story. Cities ruled by kings of impossible stature. Thrones reinforced with stone, heavier than human strength. Dynasties that did not collapse with time. These were not scattered survivors. They were organized, and that was the problem. Scripture describes kings like Og of Bashan, a ruler whose bed alone was longer than a man's body, preserved not as myth, but as proof. A physical reminder that something from before the flood still walked the earth. If giants had been judged once, why were their descendants crowned after judgment? This question destabilized everything because it suggested that divine cleansing had not fully removed the corruption, only contained it, and containment is fragile. The giants were no longer wild destroyers. They were governors, legislators, architects of fear. They ruled through structure, not chaos. And Israel understood something terrifying. You can defeat armies. You can outlast nations. But how do you confront a system that should not exist at all? This was not a war for land. It was a confrontation with unfinished judgment. These were not giants hiding in the wilderness. They ruled names, they ruled borders, they ruled fear. Ancient texts describe them not as monsters, but as kings. Og of Bashan ruled the land of volcanic stone, where cities were carved to withstand immense weight. His domain stretched across fortified regions no human king dared challenge. His bed, preserved in scripture, was not symbolism, it was evidence. The Anakim occupied Hebron, a city older than conquest itself. Their presence turned seasoned warriors into trembling scouts. Men who had crossed deserts suddenly felt small, not in faith, but in flesh. The Rephaim were remembered as shadows. Their very name became synonymous with the dead, as if they existed between life and judgment. Their valleys were avoided, their cities abandoned only after divine command. The Emim, the Zamzumim, each tribe carried the same markers: unnatural stature, territorial dominance, and a silence that followed their fall. They crossed a line humanity could not return from. These giants were not merely strong, they normalized corruption. They turned forbidden bloodlines into royal succession. They made what was once judged governable, and that is why they could not be allowed to remain. Because when corruption learns to rule, it no longer looks like evil, it looks like order. God did not act out of fear, he acted out of preservation. The giants were not destroyed because they were large, but because they were recursive. They carried a corruption that reproduced itself through bloodlines, governance, and culture. Where they ruled, worship twisted, sacrifice turned transactional, power replaced reverence. These kings did not rebel openly against God. They redefined him. They absorbed divine concepts and bent them into authority. They taught humanity how to live with corruption, not resist it, and that was the danger. Because a corrupted order is harder to destroy than chaos. Scripture records a command that chills modern readers: leave nothing alive, not as vengeance, but as quarantine. Entire cities were marked not for conquest, but removal, not to erase memory, but to prevent recurrence. The giants were biological and ideological carriers. As long as they existed, the pre-flood world could re-emerge, not through violence, but through tradition, and tradition outlives terror. God did not erase them because they were powerful. He erased them because they were sustainable. And what can endure corruption will eventually spread it. After their fall, something strange happens in Scripture. The narrative goes quiet. There are no victory songs, no lists of defeated kings, no preserved genealogies. The giants vanish, not gradually, but abruptly. Names that once ruled regions are mentioned once, then never again. Unlike pagan kings, whose legacies are recorded in detail, these rulers are denied memory. Their cities are not rebuilt. Their bloodlines are not traced. Their histories are not retold. It is as if the text itself turns away. This silence is not accidental. Ancient Jewish tradition suggests that remembering them carried risk, that knowledge of their origin, their power, could reopen what had been sealed. Because memory preserves more than facts, it preserves fascination. And fascination leads to imitation. So Scripture does something radical. It acknowledges their existence, then refuses to elaborate. A controlled mention, a sealed record, enough to warn, not enough to revive. History usually remembers its enemies, but these were not enemies. They were anomalies. And anomalies are not remembered. They are removed, not because they were forgotten, but because they were too dangerous to be remembered correctly. There is something unsettling about what was erased, not because it existed, but because it was removed on purpose. Ask yourself this: why would Scripture warn us about something, and then refuse to explain it fully? Why mention giant kings, corrupted bloodlines, forbidden rule, only to cut the story short? Perhaps the danger was never their size. Perhaps the danger was how easily humanity adapted to them. Because the giants did not conquer the world by force alone. They ruled by becoming normal. They were accepted, integrated, obeyed, and that pattern hasn't disappeared. Every era produces its own giants, systems, powers, ideas that should not exist, yet rule openly. So here's the question that matters. When corruption becomes orderly, do we recognize it, or do we call it stability? Tell me in the comments. Do you believe some truths were intentionally limited in Scripture to protect humanity? Or do you think nothing was hidden, only misunderstood? Your answer reveals more than opinion. It reveals how you see power. Goliath was never an anomaly, he was a remainder. By the time Israel faced him, the age of giant kings was already collapsing. Their cities had fallen, their dynasties had been broken, their names erased, but echoes remained. Goliath stood as one of the last visible consequences of a bloodline that refused extinction. Not ruling a nation, not commanding cities, only standing. A weapon without a throne, a relic without a future. Unlike the kings before him, Goliath did not govern systems. He did not shape culture. He did not establish order. He intimidated, and that difference matters. Because God tolerated his existence briefly, not as approval, but as closure. The earlier giants were erased because they ruled. Goliath fell because he challenged. He stood alone between eras. Behind him, a corrupted past God had dismantled. Before him, a people learning to trust divine authority over fear. When David stepped forward, it was not courage against size. It was resolution against residue. One stone was enough. Not because Goliath was weak, but because the world that sustained giants was already dead. Goliath did not represent the future. He represented the end. The giant kings fell. Their cities turned to dust. Their bloodlines were cut from the record. History moved on, or so it seems. Because the silence they left behind was never empty. It echoed across cultures, myths, and forbidden texts, all whispering the same truth. Something survived longer than it should have. Fragments of power, residual bloodlines, rulers who faded slowly, not suddenly. Israel believed the threat was over, yet fear lingered in the land for generations. Why? Because some giants were not erased by war, but by time, and time is patient. In the next video, you'll uncover the giant rulers who outlived judgment, the kings whose names were hidden deeper than Scripture admits, and why Israel feared what still walked beyond their borders. The next chapter is on your screen now, and the full journey is waiting in the playlist. If you want to understand what was erased, what was silenced, and what nearly returned, subscribe to the channel, because these stories were not forgotten, they were buried.